We've been sold a lie that Western civilization is the pinnacle of human progress, reason, and morality. But that's propaganda talking. I spent the first 21 years of my life fully indoctrinated in Christian conservatism, which I now realize is the cultural foundation for the empire that is the United States. Deconstructing Christianity and colonization is a never-ending journey, and yes, they go hand in hand. But we all have to start somewhere because we all have a part to play in building a better, more equitable future. And that's going to have to start with debunking the idea that we were ever the supreme civilization in the first place. Welcome back to the Casey Malone Show. My name is Casey Malone, and I'm so glad you're here. The term Western civilization gets thrown around a lot, like it's some unbroken concept of rationality, democracy, and progress. You've probably seen it in school curriculums, YouTube explainer videos, or more recently in political speeches. This tidy narrative that links ancient Greece to Rome, then to the Enlightenment, and finally to the United States, as though the moral arc of human history just naturally culminated in a Starbucks on every corner and the United States military patrolling half of the globe. But that is not history accurately. That is a narrative that is just marketing, and Western civilization is not a neutral, objective, or even positive concept. It's a kind of branding, carefully constructed to uphold a myth of cultural supremacy. Now, before we get too far into this, Western civilization has traditionally included both the United States and the majority of European countries, though now, under the current United States administration, a lot of European countries are understandably wanting to distance themselves from association with said current administration, and I totally get that. But unfortunately, for the concepts that I'm talking about in this segment, I am going to be using Western civilization to include European countries because we practiced the same colonization, is really what the point is. The narrative we're handed goes like this. Democracy was born in Athens, then went to Rome, then it was preserved through European Christendom, reborn in the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, and finally reaches its full expression in modern Western democracies like the United States. That's exactly what I was taught in the evangelical fundamentalist Christian high school I attended. But this is a carefully edited and intentionally edited story that leaves out most of humanity's contributions and whitewashes the parts of history that don't fit that script, that idea. This concept of Western civilization frames history as a straight line, linear path from Plato to NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, erasing entire cultures and peoples along the way. Not that I'm a huge fan of everything NATO does, but you get the point. So let's go back to Egypt as an example of ancient history that is kind of just brushed aside because it doesn't really fit into the mainstream Western civilization's historical narrative. Ancient Egypt was much more than what it is usually painted as in most United States public education systems. We are taught that it was just like a civilization of, like there were pyramids, there were pharaohs, that's it. There, this was also the place where the ancient Israelites were slaves in that one story in the Bible. That's it. But the reality is, it was also a hub of very advanced science, mathematics, and medicine. In fact, there's a lot that we still don't know about how advanced, how civilized that society actually was. But what we do know tells us that long before the Greeks, Egyptians had developed concepts of geometry, surgical tools, solar calendars, and in fact, many of the Greek philosophers we revere and hold up today, like Pythagoras and Plato, traveled to Egypt to study. But modern studies in Western civilization rarely mention this because acknowledging that much of Greek thought was influenced by African civilization kind of complicates the neat little story of European intellectual superiority. And the same goes for the African empires of Mali, Songhai, and Ethiopia. These were sophisticated states with complex systems of governance, education, and trade, and these are just a few of many that I'm naming. Timbuktu, actually, often used as a metaphor for remoteness, was actually one of the most important intellectual centers in the world during the 14th and 15th centuries. It was a central trading post on the Trans-Saharan caravan route. Its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and theology, many written in Arabic, some in indigenous languages. But you don't hear about Mali or Songhai when people talk about the roots of civilization, even though the study of evolution actually traces all of our genetics back to Africa. And all of that is because the word civilization in Western usage has always been kind of racially coded. Indigenous governance systems in the Americas were also, by the way, complex and democratic. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, operated under a more sophisticated model of federalism long before the United States Constitution was written. In fact, some of the founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, and I learned this specifically when researching for this segment, openly admired and borrowed ideas from indigenous political structures. But instead of crediting those systems, of course, the United States positioned Native people as savages in need of civilizing. Their knowledge systems, their contributions to political thought, their ecological wisdom, all erased. Western canon wanted nothing to do with it. And that also makes me bring up the East. Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist philosophies go back thousands of years, and they do offer deep insights into consciousness, ethics, and the nature of reality. The Upanishads contain philosophical and metaphysical discourses that rival anything written in the rest, especially the Bible. You've got to be kidding me. Buddhist logic schools developed system of debate and epistemology that mirror Western rationalism, but we weren't really taught that, were we? These traditions shaped entire civilizations, but they rarely appear in world history textbooks in the United States unless they're framed as spiritual or mystical rather than intellectual. And we all know how the West loves to promote rationalism over intuition, and that's worked out so well. Edward Said's foundational work called Orientalism, which I haven't read in full but I know of and read a few summaries for this segment, this work makes it clear. He argues that the West only truly defined itself by inventing its opposite, aka the East. Europe constructed the Orient as exotic, irrational, and inferior, so it could see itself as rational, free, and civilized. And this binary specifically emerged from empire. By the way, empire is quite adept at manufacturing distinctions amongst people and creating divisions so that binaries can exist. So as Europe expanded through colonization, it needed a story or a narrative that justified its domination so that people could consent to this domination. And so it told one that it was the bearer of enlightenment and order in a chaotic, backward world. The myth of Western civilization still lingers today in every conversation that positions the Western world as a beacon of liberty and everyone else is catching up. So when we talk about Western civilization, what we're really talking about is a curated version of history that selectively includes whatever makes Europe and later the United States look like the natural leaders of humanity. It's not that Greek philosophy or the Enlightenment weren't important, it's that they didn't develop in a vacuum. They weren't inevitable. They were deeply interwoven with and often directly borrowed from other cultures that were later dismissed as primitive or underdeveloped. And the worst part of this is the West didn't necessarily just ignore these other knowledge systems or cultures, it actively erased them. Colonizers have burned libraries, okay? Not just military bases, libraries, not to mention hospitals and civilians. Missionaries have intentionally and systematically destroyed temples and sacred texts. Entire languages and oral histories were wiped out in the name of civilization. This was an active intellectual colonization, and it is why colonization has such a stronghold in the minds of all of us to this day. European scholars claimed the mantle of universal knowledge while portraying the rest of the world as its raw material where it gets its inspiration, but not its actual manifestation of intellectualism. And this intellectual theft still shapes our world. It still affects all of us. It affects what's taught in schools, who gets published, whose voices seem as authoritative and whose seem as fringe or extreme. It defines the boundaries of credible philosophy and real science, and it reinforces a worldview in which Western institutions are the default, objective, neutral, advanced, while everyone else is seen as derivative, emotional, or spiritual. When people say the West is more advanced, more rational, or more civilized, they're not stating a fact, they're regurgitating propaganda. Western civilization is not a civilization. It's a story, a narrative, a brand, a story that justifies empire and cultural erasure. And it's time we stop telling it uncritically, without really questioning it. Because the real history of human progress is far more global, collaborative, and interconnected than the myth allows. And when we recognize that, we open ourselves up to a far richer understanding of who we are and who we could become. One of the most persistent lies in the myth of Western supremacy is that the West, and particularly Christianity, is somehow responsible for modern scientific advancement. We're taught that without the guiding hand of Christianity, the world would still be in the Dark Ages. But history tells a very different story. The Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, often held up as pinnacles of Western intellectual achievement, did not emerge because of the church. Let's be so fucking for real. They emerged in opposition to it. And much of the foundational knowledge that powered these so-called Western breakthroughs didn't originate in Europe at all. It was inherited, borrowed, or stolen from other civilizations, particularly the Islamic world, South Asia, and East Asia. Let's start with the tension between Christianity and early science, which is still very prominent to this day. Let's remember that the Catholic Church has never been known for nurturing scientific inquiry. It's not out of left field to recognize that it has rather spent a fuck ton of time and energy actively suppressing it. The church maintained a monopoly on knowledge for so long and punished deviation pretty fucking harshly. Scientific progress didn't flourish under Christianity. It had to fight its way through it via visionaries like Galileo and Bruno. Meanwhile, while Europe was slowly crawling out of the intellectual stranglehold of the church, the Islamic world was already thriving in what's now known as the Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly the 8th to the 14th centuries. During this time, Muslim scholars and scientists were building libraries, translating Greek and Persian texts, and producing groundbreaking original work in every field from mathematics to medicine. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a renowned center of learning and innovation. It was a research institute, a translation hub, and it was almost also kind of like a think tank all rolled into one. And this is important because we are constantly getting the message here in the United States about how when you compare the religion of Islam with the religion of Christianity, it's supposedly obvious how backwards and unprogressive and even violent Islam is in comparison with the more modernized, civilized, and even moral faith system of Christianity. But as many of you know, I will never stand for the idea of any patriarchal Abrahamic religion to be better than any other. Just a few hundred years ago, the argument about which religion was more violent, oppressive, and uncivilized would easily have gone to Christianity. But then, Western empires like Britain, France, etc. started systematically using whatever iterations of Christianity suited them to further expand their colonialism and imperialism throughout the rest of the goddamn world. After they spent centuries fighting incredibly bloody internal wars about Catholicism versus Protestantism versus Anglicanism or whatever. As a result, societies that have been non-Christian for a long-ass time are understandably resistant to the idea of a global Christendom. I will never be a supporter of religious fundamentalism or religious authoritarianism or religious extremism of any faith, but to suggest that in the grand scheme of human history, any specific patriarchal Abrahamic religion is any better or worse than one of the others, that's bullshit. They are all so harmful, and frankly, we could do without the lot of them. And that's not to say that everyday practitioners of faith-based systems are inherently violent or unwell. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be the freedom to practice whatever religion you want. Of course there should be. I'm not trying to suggest that good things have never come out of religious environments. But what we're often hearing in the United States, even amongst the atheist community in which I participate, is that somehow Christianity has on the whole been less harmful as Islam and has produced more positive results for the progress of humankind. But this is not true, and it's a narrative that is deliberately intended to indoctrinate us into thinking that other cultures, other religions, other peoples throughout the world deserve our quote-unquote civilizing efforts, through war. But I digress. Let's look at some examples of ways that the progress of human science and achievement has actually been more global in efforts and not so much concentrated within the powers of a few famous white scientists. Consider, and please excuse all of my pronunciations here, Al-Khwarizmi, who gave us the word algorithm. He systematized algebra and wrote foundational texts that introduced Hindu Arabic numerals to the Western world. There's also Ibn al-Haytham, who wrote the Book of Optics, establishing the scientific method centuries before Francis Bacon. He conducted controlled experiments with light and vision, laying the groundwork for modern physics and optics. Then there's Avicenna, who wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text that became standard reading in European medical schools for centuries. He outlined treatments for numerous diseases, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques that were far more advanced than anything happening in Christian Europe at the time. And outside of the Islamic world in China, scholars had already developed the printing press centuries before the Gutenberg press, and I should not have been an adult when I learned that. They invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and seismographs. Chinese astronomers charted comets and eclipses with extraordinary precision. Their civil service exams required a deep understanding of mathematics, ethics, and governance centuries before such ideas caught on in the West. In India, the concept of zero had already been developed by the 5th century CE, a revolutionary idea that underpins all modern computing. No big deal. Indian mathematicians contributed to trigonometry, calculus, and infinite series, which is a thing that I learned one time in calculus. And in the realm of language and logic, Panini's ancient Sanskrit grammar laid the foundations for linguistic theory, arguably making him the world's first formal linguist. All of this knowledge made its way to Europe through trade, contracts, and sometimes peaceful cultural exchange. The Crusades, for all their brutality, did open up contact between the Islamic world and Christendom. European scholars began translating Arabic texts into Latin, often without crediting the original authors. It's through this process that the so-called Western Enlightenment was born. European thinkers stood on the shoulders of global geniuses but rarely acknowledged them. It wasn't a birth of knowledge, it was a conglomeration of it. And once that transfer was complete, Western historians whitewashed the original story to make it look indigenous to their culture. That's not to say Europe made no contributions, but the idea that the West generated science independently from first principles out of sheer brilliance and Christian fucking virtue is laughably false. This matters because it challenges the core of the Western supremacy myth. If science, the prized emblem of Western modernity, wasn't purely Western, then what else have we misunderstood? What other narratives and messages have we been told that we should be questioning? Is there anything that makes us better, actually, than the rest of the world? Is there any core fundamental reason we should be putting America first? When people point to the scientific achievements of the West as evidence of cultural or moral superiority, we have to push back. Because the roots of science are not nation-based, they're not Christian, they're not Western, they are global, they are collaborative, and they are the results of thousands of years of shared human curiosity. The real story of science isn't a linear journey all the way to NASA. It is a vast, messy, multicultural tapestry of ideas, exchanges, and breakthroughs that no one civilization can lay claim as their own. The idea that the West is uniquely rational, democratic, or moral, which is a key one, is one of the most powerful and dangerous myths in modern history. It's the ideological scaffolding that props up everything from foreign intervention to economic exploitation to white supremacy. This belief that Western civilization represents the pinnacle of reasoned and ethical governance does more than just distort history. It enables ongoing violence by disguising it as benevolence. It says things like, we're bringing these other people liberation and civilization. We're told that Western societies are more enlightened, more logical, and more just. But if you actually trace what the West has done with its supposed rationality, let's be real. You'll find a legacy soaked in blood, control, war, colonialism, genocide, and the list goes on. The unfortunate truth that we are not taught in elementary school is that all of this was very much intentional. We are talking about genocidal colonization. European empires didn't just stumble into domination. They didn't manifest it because they happened to be better. They planned it. They mapped, measured, and cataloged the lands they would take and the people they would destroy. The civilizing mission was framed as a rational moral duty or responsibility, but in practice, it meant cultural erasure, economic exploitation, and again, mass death. From the Congo Free State under King Leopold II to the forced assimilation of indigenous children in North American residential schools, Western imperialism has time and again carried out systematic, calculated violence in the name of order and progress. Then came the World Wars. Far from being proof of the moral maturity or diplomatic excellence that we claim, the 20th century showed just how deeply the West was willing to descend into fucking madness. 2 world wars, launched and fought by the most civilized nations on Earth, resulted in the deaths of over 100 million people. These wars weren't fought by supposedly backward societies, by the way. They were waged by the supposed centers of European power, fueled by nationalist ideologies, imperial rivalries, and economic interests. All of the things that those same nations claim Middle Eastern countries are at fault for. And it was Western science, by the way, that created the most devastating weapon in human history, the atomic bomb. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not a moral failing of religion, by the way. It was a rational, strategic decision by a democratic government using the best minds of Western science to incinerate civilians, and then the religion of imperialism here in the United States, being Christianity, found a way to fucking justify it. Even after the dust of global war settled, the violence has never stopped. It has just evolved. Today, Western rationalism shows up as global surveillance capitalism. There's a reason for everything, right? A system like this commodifies attention, it manipulates our behavior, and it is mining human data at a scale previously unimaginable. Tech companies headquartered in Silicon Valley, hailed as beacons of innovation, have built digital empires that harvest the thoughts, movements, desires, and energy of billions of people. These systems are, guess what? Rational. They're logical, they're profitable, and they're incredibly efficient. But they are also invasive and exploitative and deeply undemocratic. In many ways, modern capitalism is where the myth of Western supremacy and its rationalism reaches its final form, at least I hope so. Seamless control disguised as convenience. And let's not forget the history of scientific racism, which is something I try to remind people of all the time. This is a direct product of Enlightenment Europe. The same period that produced talk of liberty and natural rights also gave birth to eugenics and theories of racial hierarchy. Enlightenment-era thinkers categorized people into racial types and ranked them by intelligence, morality, and capacity for civilization. These ideas were not for the fringe extremists, they were mainstream. They were taught in universities, cited in court decisions, and used to justify slavery, colonization, and segregation. And a lot of these pseudoscientific ideas have continued well into the 20th century and have quietly resurfaced today under the banner of genetics and biology. Now, I'm about as anti-establishment as a person can get, but if I had to choose any human-made institution we should be looking to for guidance, I would have hoped it would be the academic one. And yet, because we're, well, human, Even that establishment has a track record of imperfection, which I think is important to recognize. This is the core contradiction at the heart of Western self-image. The same societies that claim to be champions of reasoned and human dignity have also led the world in organized mass violence, environmental destruction, systemic dehumanization, and state-funded genocides. And rather than reckon with that contradiction, the myth of Western rationalism has simply reframed the atrocities. Again, this goes back to rebranding. Everything is justified in the name of stability, security, or progress. Frantz Fanon once said, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. What he meant is that the wealth, power, and institutions of the West were built through the extraction of labor and resources from colonized people. The very framework of Western democracy and capitalism was underwritten by the suffering of those deemed less rational, less civilized, and less human. So the next time someone tells you that the West is more logical, more moral, or more advanced, ask them to explain how that squares with genocide, slavery, and nuclear war. Ask them why so much Western progress looks like exploitation. And then, and here's the kicker, ask them who actually benefited from all of that supposed rationality. Because if the answer isn't something along the lines of most, if not all of us, then maybe it's time we start building something different, something more humane, and guess what? Truly rational. Not just for the few, but for all. Now let's talk about how Christianity is a part of this conversation. I talked about Christian morality in more depth in my last segment, so I'm not going to get into too much details here. But Christianity is propped up as the ultimate way of life for everyday people in this country and in Western civilization to live good, wholesome, moral, productive lives. And this might be difficult for more progressive Christians to swallow, but it is so important. Christianity, in any way, shape, or form, in any denomination, in any iteration of your progressive version of it, is a tool of empire. It is the language of the oppressor. The point of decolonizing our ways of thinking is to stop letting people in power trick you into thinking that the answers to your problems lie outside of yourself in the form of any kind of savior. You are your answer. You are your savior. Any mental gymnastics you perform to keep justifying a patriarchal, Abrahamic religious narrative is just propaganda. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm not saying you're a stupid person. I spent 2/3 of my life as an evangelical Christian. I get it. But even if you don't want to give up your faith, we have got to recognize that Christianity has functioned as the cultural machinery of conquest. Wherever colonizers went, missionaries followed, or more often, they went first. Their work was not neutral, and it certainly wasn't just about personal salvation. Missionary efforts were the ideological front line of imperial expansion. They were a means of softening resistance from indigenous peoples. They, in fact, dismantled indigenous belief systems, and they introduced the social hierarchies needed to justify and maintain European control. Christian missionaries would show up with all of their supposed loving kindness, lull indigenous peoples into a relationship of trust, so then when the military came later on, those peoples would be less likely to fight off the imperialism. And don't give me, well, that has nothing to do with Jesus. Jesus would never. You're worshiping some guy. I respect that if it's so important to you and you consider it a part of your personal spiritual transformation, even though the internal psychological processes of spiritual growth and devolution are actually you invoking the power of bringing yourself peace and blessings, not an external force. If you want to call that power Jesus Christ, I want you to have that right. I will fight for your right to call that spiritual experience whatever the fuck you want to call it. But beyond your individual experience on a systemic level, I don't think that's enough to erase the harm and violence that has been done in the name of Jesus Christ. I just don't. In Africa, Asia, and the Americas, missionary work was almost always bound with colonization. The goals of this work might have had some innocence behind it, but in large part, these efforts were social and cultural and political. Missionaries would enter a territory, study the local customs, and begin a systematic process of moral reprogramming. Indigenous cosmologies were declared pagan or demonic. Ancestor veneration, animism, and polytheism were labeled as superstitions that had to be uprooted. Spirituality, which had often been deeply intertwined intertwined with environmental stewardship and collective life was replaced with a rigid, male-dominated theology that emphasized obedience, shame, and hierarchy. Again, if you're worshiping Jesus, you're just worshiping some guy. Christianity served and still serves as a way to enforce ideological conformity. It moralizes submission to authority. It literally preaches that you should have a servant's heart. It tells people that suffering is basically holy next to godliness, and it teaches that justice comes in the afterlife, not in this one. Does that not sound insanely convenient for the ruling class? And most insidiously, it taught us that we had to look outside of ourselves at some hero to save us. Because when we're looking at someone else to make things better for us in the here and now, we're not going to try and make things better on our own. We're not going to organize our communities. We're going to trust what our government says about our neighbor over trusting our neighbor. I am begging you to stop letting institutions brainwash you into thinking that you don't have the ability to save yourself from the mess that they made. Christianity has also historically framed resistance as a kind of sin, if you really think about it. Indigenous uprisings, worker strikes, feminist movements, all of these have been labeled as rebellions, not just against empire, but against God. And that is the genius of using religion as a tool of empire. It doesn't just control the body, it controls the conscious, the mind. Today, when Christian nationalists in the United States call for the country to return to its biblical roots, they are echoing this same imperial theology. They want to reinstate a moral order that has always been about power, not faith. When they say family values, they mean patriarchal authority. When they say religious freedom, they mean the freedom to dominate. It is up to us to recognize this language for what it is. Again, understanding Christianity's role as the cultural arm of empire means seeing it not as a personal belief system, but as a political technology. It was used to mold the conscience of the colonized, to undermine collective resistance, and to align entire societies with the values of empire, hierarchy, discipline, profit, and control. And again, while some individual Christians have resisted this legacy, standing on the side of liberation and justice, the institution of Christianity, as it has operated historically, cannot be separated from its role in conquest. So when someone says Christianity civilized the world, we have to ask what they mean by civilization. Because if it looks like conversion, forced conversion, cultural erasure, and child abuse, we should stop pretending it was ever a good thing. Christianity didn't civilize the world, it helped colonize it, and I stand by that. And its legacy still shapes how power operates today, from missionary aid organizations to Christian nationalist legislation. To build a just world, we've got to confront not just the empires of the past, but the moral systems that have made them possible, the cultural ideology behind them. Now, I recognize that Christianity has a large spectrum of political beliefs and educational backgrounds. I am an atheist, but I try very hard to advocate for the liberation of everyday Christians from the day-to-day struggles of living under a difficult society, as well as from the multi-million-dollar propaganda machine that works to keep them disempowered. I know there are good, kind Christians out there because I grew up next to you. I know that you have moral stances that I align with, but the algorithms that are fed to us by for-profit billionaire CEOs have alienated us from each other. I am begging you to meet me in the middle here. I am begging you to wake up to the trillion-dollar Israeli propaganda machine that is convincing you to support Israel's actions at all costs, even genocidal costs. I do not want to take away your right to worship however you want, but you are being manipulated into believing that your neighbors are trying to take things from you, like your jobs, your right to worship, your right to raise your kids however you want. It is not easy to come to terms with how manipulated the Christian church is in this country, how complicit the Christian church is in reinforcing harmful narratives that go right along with what the corporate billionaires want you to believe. It is not easy to question whether or not you've been lied to your entire life. In fact, I know exactly how easy it is to just accept that you happen to believe in the one true God. You happen to adhere to the one religion that has the only unique relationship with that which is divine through Jesus Christ. It is so much easier to feel aligned with righteousness when that form of righteousness claims to save you from an eternity of hellfire. But what you're not recognizing when you do that is how it results in your subconscious dehumanization of people who don't adhere to the same religion as you. And you're not recognizing that you're sacrificing your agency to determine for yourself what it means to be a moral person. Do you not question how such a belief system that is predicated on the idea of believers versus non-believers, of people going to heaven for eternity versus people going to hell for eternity, sets up an internal psychological system that relies on your prejudices against those who are different from you? All I'm asking is for you to consider the possibility that you weren't taught the truth. People in power in this country would have you believe that you live in the greatest country in the world, but make no mistake. What they mean is you live in the most capitalist country in the world, the most militarized. It is not the land of the free when we lead the world in the number of incarcerated people. It is not the home of the brave when the population fell prey to fear-mongering and voted Donald Trump into office. It is time that we stop believing the myth that Western civilization and or the United States is somehow better than the rest of the world. The reality is, decolonizing knowledge and raising the collective consciousness is about recognizing that the world is far richer, more complex, and more interconnected than the myth of Western supremacy ever allowed. And it's about finally telling a story that includes all of us. I hope you enjoyed this segment outlining the violent hypocrisy of the United States just in time for July 4th, America's Independence Day. If you can't tell at this point, I'm not exactly the most patriotic person in this country. The United States isn't quite my vibe, if you feel me, which is why I won't be celebrating this empire on July 4th. Instead, I will be releasing my first single as a musical artist, and the single is titled Lies in God's Country. I poured my heart and soul into this work for you, for us, for the people who are looking around at this country and are waking up to the recognition that the United States is the evil empire in every sci-fi and fantasy series we love. Lies in God's Country is essentially my offering to become the anti-establishment anthem for those of us willing to resist. It will be available at noon Central Time on YouTube on July 4th. I'd be honored if you checked it out. No gods, no masters, no kings.